Hello, friends. How are you doing? Man, it has been a crazy week for me, and it's just going to get crazier and busier. I'm about midway through the semester, and I have 3 A's and 2 B pluses, and I'm just like trying so hard to get those B's up to A's. Lordy. I also got selected for student government as a senator, which is pretty cool. And I did tell you guys I got accepted into the National Honor Society, Omicron Delta Kappa, and I will be inducted in a couple weeks. So that's really cool. We also have some friends from Guatemala staying with us for a couple of weeks. So that is really fun. We are having such a wonderful time. And they also have kids, so it's going to be really fun to maybe take them trick-or-treating because obviously we only have a dog and we don't have kids. So, it's kind of weird to walk around with just a dog to grab candy, but when we do it with the kids, it'll be kind of fun. I have a costume and Augie has a costume. I'm not going to tell you guys what it is yet because I will post pictures. Also, although this is part 2 of the Jonestown Massacre, I am going, in the spirit of Halloween, I am going to do another episode this week. And it will be about Halloween, actually. I'm going to try to post that later in the week, maybe Friday or Saturday. So really exciting stuff. Today it's been really rainy here, so that hasn't been good, but I have been catching up with homework, and now I'm recording. So here we go. So last week we talked about Jonestown and the psychological aspects behind the leader Jim Jones and how things came to be. So today we're going to dive deeper into more of what happened. So more of the true crime aspect. So, get ready. I'm your host, Kitty Gonzalez, and you're listening to What the Psychology. Okay, so you remember last week how we talked about how there was a group of followers who left the group and they created their own concerned relatives and they started petitioning to the government and like all of these things were going on and they were afraid that things were going wrong and that they still had relatives in Jonestown, which is in Guyana, South America. And they were just really concerned, so they were writing to Congress. They were trying to figure out if anyone can investigate, make sure they're safe, make sure they're okay. And this is kind of where things, unfortunately, turned for the worst. Now, you think if you're going to have a visitor come and visit that you would just give them the horse and pony show, but instead they decided to do things differently in Jonestown. So, before we go on, I did get my sources from history.com, and I'm trying to think of where I got the other one from, but most of it was a piece where they interviewed the deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, Richard Dwyer, and I'm going to read some of what he has talked about and also I might get some recordings of this if I can find any. So let's see where this takes us. So Leo Ryan was a U.S. representative from California. And he heard from some of his constituents that their family members were people being held against their will at Jonestown and decided to go there to investigate. Like I said, remember, a lot of family members a lot of people that defected, their family members were still there, and they were greatly concerned. So Leo Ryan decided, I'm going to go there and investigate and see what's going on. So Ryan, he arrived in Guyana in November of 1978 with a delegation that included news reporters and photographers. along with concerned relatives of some of the People's Temple members. And I'm pretty sure some of those included people that were previously there. On November 17th, the congressmen and reporters were welcomed to the Jonestown compound. And to their surprise, they had a dinner and an evening of entertainment. Jim Jones himself, he even agreed to meet with reporters. However, during the visit, some People's Temple members asked Ryan's group to help them get out of Jonestown. What? So it kind of sounds like people that were concerned had a right to be concerned. There were people there that were still there that wanted to get out and just didn't know how. So on November 18th, Ryan and his group, which also included a small contingent of People's Temple defectors, left Jonestown. However, while they were waiting at a nearby jungle airstrip, they were ambushed by gunmen sent by Jim Jones himself. Congressman Ryan was killed, along with a reporter and cameraman from NBC, a photographer from the San Francisco Examiner, and a female People's Temple member who was attempting to leave. Honestly, I don't understand why they just didn't let them leave. Like, what is the point of killing them? Well, actually, there kind of is an explanation behind this. One of the reasons why they did leave the United States to begin with was Jim Jones wasn't too happy about the criticism that they were receiving. They were getting some media attention, and he wasn't really liking what was being said about him and his group. So that's one of the reasons why they moved their little compound to Jonestown in Guyana in the first place. Now, the same day as the murders at the airstrip, Jones told his followers that soldiers would come for them and torture them. Y'all, I was in the military. We don't just show up places and torture people, not for no reason. We don't just show up place. But in this sense, it would have been a rescue type mission. It wouldn't have been to attack people. Anyways, yeah, I digress. So, Jones, he ordered everyone to gather in the main pavilion and commit what he termed a, quote,
revolutionary act.
Now, sadly enough, the youngest members of the People's Temple were the first to die. As parents and nurses, they used syringes to drop a potent mix of cyanide, sedatives, and powdered fruit juice into the children's throats. Now, Jones, he actually reported that he obtained a jeweler's license at some earlier point, which enabled him to stockpile cyanide. And you guys, like, so horrific. After this, after all the children were killed, the adults then lined up to drink the poison-laced cocktail while armed guards surrounded the pavilion. So this horrific event is the source of the phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid or drinking the Kool-Aid. And the thing is, there was a lot of debate why people did this. And not everyone did drink the Kool-Aid. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But imagine being one of those adults that did. They gave their children poison and witnessed them dying. Well, maybe not so. I guess it depends on how fast the components of the cocktail or, whatever they had in the syringe, they had the syringe, they dropped the liquid into their mouths. Kind of like if you feed children or like dogs medicine. But imagine they gave that to them and then took it themselves. They just followed orders. Like, it's crazy to me. Unfortunately, they were so brainwashed into thinking that it's either you take your life or these other people are going to come and torture you and you'll probably die anyways. They were led to think that, and they truly believed that. I just can't imagine giving that to a kid. But like I said, I guess it really does depend on the dosage and if they really witnessed them dying in front of them, because then maybe they would think, oh, it's just another drill. Remember last week we talked about how they would do suicide drills. They would do drills where they would actually practice doing this. And of course, none of the other times it worked. It was a drill. But another thing is, was it used as a drill to see if they were truly committed or not? Or was it they're thinking this time is, oh, it's just another drill. We're not really going to die. So who really knows, I guess. Can't really ask the people, unfortunately. The next day, Guyanese officials, they arrived at Jonestown, and they found it carpeted with hundreds of bodies. Unfortunately, many people have perished with their arms around each other. Jim Jones, he was 47. He was found in a chair, dead from a single bullet wound to the head, most likely self-inflicted. Now, another issue I have is they said that the people were surrounded by guards. So I guess another thing would be they were forced to take the drink because they would either take the drink or be shot anyways, right? And also, what happened to the security guards afterwards? Like, I wonder, did they take the poison? Because if they're security guards, were they also indoctrinated or were they just more kind of there? Alright, so the death toll at Jonestown on November 18th, 1978 was 909 people. And a third of those were children. Literally, I believe there's a number here. Over 200 children murdered. That is insane. And that just breaks my heart. These young lives that never really got to live. They didn't have a choice to be there. They had to follow their parents around and make their decisions. Oh man. Now, a few people did manage to escape into the jungle that day, while at least several dozen more People's Temple members, including several of Jones's sons, were in another part of Guyana at the time. So in total, only 33 people survived. And wow, that's just insane. Can you imagine? You know how people, they get like grief, guilt type thing? Like they say that if they would have been at a certain part, they would have been died or something. Survivor's guilt. It's called survivor guilt, sorry. When people survive but they shouldn't have, like they should have been there or whatever, and then they have that guilt that they carry. When honestly it's like you should be happy that you were spared kind of thing, I guess. Or it's very unfortunate that other people died, but at least you're alive. But survivor's guilt is a thing, and that might be something else we talk about later on, and maybe not in this episode, but maybe in a different one. There was a terrifying recording of this event, and this is known as the death tape. And luckily, it did have positive effects. It did help investigators understand what did happen that night. And researchers, they also found over 1,000 recordings of propaganda, conversations, and sermons that painted a gruesome picture of the activities of the People's Temple. So 909 people, that does include Congressman Leo Ryan and the temple members and crew members and people that were shot at the Port Kaituma airstrip. And another really crazy thing that Jonestown is noted for, it was actually the largest mass suicide in modern history and resulted in the largest single loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster until September 11, 2001, which we just honored not too long ago. We do know that Jones had established the People's Temple. Remember, it started in Indiana in about 1950s. And then he moved to San Francisco, and then they moved to Guyana. One thing that did happen when Ryan and everyone else was about to leave, several of the Jonestown residents actually approached the group and asked them for passage. So what happened the next day when Ryan and the defectors were going to leave? Jones became very distressed, and one of his lieutenants attacked Ryan with a knife. He actually escaped from the incident unharmed, but Jones then ordered Ryan and his companions to ambush and kill them as they attempted to leave, and they did just that. So the congressman and the 4 others, they were murdered as they boarded their charter plane. Richard Dwyer. He was the deputy chief, and when the tragedy took place, he does recount a lot of the prelude to the massacre, and he was actually one of the members on the airstrip, and he pretended to be dead when they were shot at the airstrip, and he dealt with the subsequent harrowing events in the aftermath. So he was interviewed by ADST's Charles Stewart Kennedy starting in July of 1990. I want to actually read a lot of what he said because his account is crazy. It is insane. So everything that I read is literally from him, and I'll try to add things here and there. But man, his is just interesting. So here we go. Jonestown was up in the bush in the northwest portion of the country, 150 miles by chartered airplane from Georgetown. Shortly after I got there, Ambassador Burke suggested that one of the first things I ought to do was visit Jonestown, along with the chief of the consular section, Dick McCoy. I went up there shortly after I got to Georgetown. There was, I suppose, about 900 to 1,000 people there at the time. There's actually a picture of this, and I'm going to try to post a lot of these pictures when I publish this. So Jonestown had a half hour or a 45-minute program on the Georgetown radio at least once a week. It was a publicity and propaganda type of thing of what they were doing with forests, how many acres they had cleared, what they had grown, how they were establishing their big farm, their chicken ranch, cattle, how they were developing new crops, etc. It sounded very impressive on the radio. Now, side note for me, guys, you remember that they were promised a utopia, and when they got there, all their crops wouldn't grow, and they had no food, and that's when things started to make a turn for the worst. More quotes from accounting Dwyer's story. Indeed, at first glance, Jonestown itself was very impressive. It reminded me of the early days in a kibbutz in Israel. There was still a great deal of that enthusiasm. What was weird was that as they were taking me around to look at these things were being described in exactly the same words I had heard on the radio program just the week before. In other words, they were repeated. It was the same thing being repeated. Now, the Jonestown people, as far as they could see, they were not physically abused. They were weary, and there was no question that they worked hard to accomplish what they did, but none of them maintained that they were forced to do so or leave. None of the people that McCoy interviewed privately expressed a desire to leave. The people at Jonestown were a mix. The large proportion of them were urban black, many from the ghettos. There were many elderly people that they were called the seniors. These undoubtedly had an attraction for Jones because they had Social Security benefits that were sent to them in Guyana, which they would then endorse. So a lot of their money would help be income for the temple. And remember, in this paradise, they all worked and never got paid. Their time was pretty much money, I guess, to Jones. Like, they didn't earn paychecks. Like, everyone would put money into a pot kind of thing. And look how it turned out. It just, no. It didn't work, and it never does work. It just doesn't. More from Dwyer. Somewhere about then, we were notified that a congressional delegation would be coming to see us. This would be a delegation of 2 or 3 congressmen led by Congressman Leo Ryan of California, whose district included a number of constituents, both among the relatives and among the people in Jonestown itself. Looking back on it, it was amazing how little we knew about what had happened in California with the People's Temple, or about Ryan, or what he knew, or for that matter, what consular affairs and the Department of State knew. So it seems like a lot of the information was kind of unknown at this point. Like, they didn't really know a lot about Jonestown, or if there was really a big issue at this point. They were pretty much just there to investigate. So, Congressman Ryan, he had been a high school teacher and had a friend whose grandchildren were at Jonestown, and he was very concerned about them. This was also kind of personal to the congressman, which doesn't really get talked about a lot. A lot of people just assume he went there because other people in his district were concerned, which is very true, but he also had some personal tie to this as well. So the father of these children had been killed in an alleged accident in a railroad yard in Los Angeles. The suspicion being, but never proved, that the People's Temple were responsible for it, that it was in fact a murder. The mother had taken the children to Jonestown, so it was a very personal concern of Congressman Ryan's. That is very, very crazy. I've never heard about that up until digging about this and hearing Dwyer's own testimony about this, and that's just crazy. I never heard that there was a conspiracy or that another event took place and that they were kind of blamed for it. Back to Dwyer. And something else that I've been aware of until he told us, John Burke and myself, on his arrival, that he had a daughter who was very much involved in the Church of Scientology, and he thought that they did much good work. So he wasn't necessarily against all cults, but he had some experience with that. He had been a leader in getting the Congress to pass a resolution urging the pardoning of Patty Hearst. In other words, a man who had had some experience with publicity and unusual ways to get it. Nonetheless, his interest in Jonestown was probably very real. More from Dwyer. I should say that Ryan arrived not only with the press, but a whole bunch of People's Temple's relatives. I don't remember how many came down, 15 or 20 or so. We were met at the airstrip by a local government representative and a group of people from the People's Temple. The group of people from the People's Temple were unfriendly, to say the least. So it pretty much seemed like the People's Temple, they didn't really want them there, which I can get. You have people coming there to investigate that are kind of up in your business, and you're like, oh, everything's fine over here, but, I get it, privacy's a thing, but literally, these people were so brainwashed. And man, it reminds me of this movie that I saw one time, and I cannot think of the title for the life of me. Oh, I'm gonna have to do some digging and try to find it, but it was, so it was definitely a psychological thriller, but it was about a guy who kind of went out of this way. He was part of this overall group, and I can't remember, they would say so-and-so is watching, and they're always watching, because other members of the group would always watch each other. And at one point, he was still part of the group, but took a non-member that needed help to, the hospital, and his friends were, the nurses there, and he said, please do not tell anybody, that we are here, I'm just trying to get her help. And while they were leaving, they were approached by the friend and said that, they're on their way, that they had reported them. He's like, I told you not to say anything. But people in that movie, they were also so manipulated into being so brainwashed. Whew, craziness. I'm going to have to look that up, and maybe by the end of this, I can edit and add it in here, but we'll see. So Jim Jones, he did come out eventually, and he talked to Congressman Ryan for a little bit. Ryan did explain that he was on an official delegation, that he had no axe to grind, and that he wanted to see for himself so that he could report to his constituents. Jim Jones gave his usual spiel that these were people who had been emotionally and economically deprived in the United States, and the whole purpose of his wilderness settlement was to remove them from the temptation of the large city. And although he said at one point that if he had to do it over again, maybe he would not remove them quite so far, the People's Temple were the victims of malicious and untrue propaganda put out by the concerned relatives. So after spending a whole day there, that's when they decided to leave. From what Mr. Dwyer is saying, the big dump truck was pulled up and the concerned relatives who were leaving began to load their things on it. The mass of People's Temple members stood around quietly and watched. There were some exchanges. Then a man came up with, I think, 2 children and said that he wanted to come too and take the children. A woman followed him, screaming, saying, "You can't take my children. My children and I stay here." We had the most difficult problem of a consular's officer's life of a custody question right there. By this time, I knew we had a small single-engine aircraft coming up that would carry 4 people. I wanted to get as many people out of there as possible. With this couple coming, we told them that whether the man was coming with the children or without the children was not something that we could decide. There was a legal question that we had no authority to determine, but it looked like although we didn't have any more people wanting to go, with the exception of a young man who came very late who said he wanted to go, it looked conceivably that we might have some more if we talked to people. So it seems like more and more people wanted to go and would voice that. And then they had a suspicion that maybe other people wanted to go and they just wouldn't announce it openly. So Congressman Ryan and Mr. Dwyer, they talked about it. Now, Dwyer said that they decided that they would stay. In fact, Ryan decided that he would stay, and if he stayed, then Mr. Dwyer would stay overnight again. The people who were leaving could go, and Mr. Dwyer said that he would take all of those who were leaving to the airport and then return with the truck. So they had everybody pretty much loaded up on the truck, and that's when things kind of changed. Now, this is part of Mr. Dwyer's testimony. Anyway, we were all on the truck, then suddenly there came shouts and screams from the pavilion. I got off the truck and ran back to the pavilion. A couple of the large young men who were the security force for the People's Temple would not let the press or anyone else besides myself, I guess, they let one press guy go by. We arrived at the pavilion to find Congressman Ryan standing shaken with blood all over his shirt and another young man being held by members of the People's Temple. What had happened, apparently, was that this young man had approached Ryan from behind with a knife, grabbed him from the back, and put the knife to his throat and said that he was going to kill him. A couple of the People's Temple members and one of the lawyers grabbed the guy and wrestled him to the ground. In the process, the young man's hand was cut and he bled all over Ryan's shirt. Ryan said that the young man had to be put into custody and the police had to be notified. Now, the only real police were at Matthews Ridge, an old mining town about 30 miles away, except for the guy in shorts with a shotgun in town. He was assured that this would be done and that he would be prosecuted under Guyanese law and that they would call the police right away. I mean, of course, they had no means of calling the police anyways. Like, they don't want these people there anyways, so why would they call the police and have more people involved? Now, Congressman Ryan, he was clearly shaken, but he was still very much in command of himself. And he walked to Mr. Dwyer and he actually asked, "What do we do now?" Mr. Dwyer answered, "Congressman, I am not sure what I'm going to do, but I want you out of here right now as fast as we can." Congressman Ryan said, "Will you stay and see about the people who want to come back?" Mr. Dwyer said, "Yes, I would." He also said, looking back at it, he shudders to think about it, but in any event, his main concern was getting out of there. Now, Congressman Ryan was standing out by the wingtip. The airplane was facing south, and the engines were running. Congressman Ryan started to walk towards the aircraft when a farm tractor pulled on the field, towing a farm cart with wooded sides going up 2 or 3 feet. The tractor pulled onto the field and came along the side of the tarmac. I turned around to look, and as we watched, 9 or 10 people stood up from the truck, and they had various guns. Could you imagine this sight, you guys? Like, me, I would be shook. Like, I would not know what to do. Like, especially if you don't have any guns on you to fight back. And another thing, you're clearly outnumbered. So, oh my gosh. So, the various guns that they had shotguns, 22s, 30-06, and other various things. Luckily, they had no automatic weapons. But they did begin to fire, and the congressman was obviously a target. Mr. Dyer and Ryan, they ran out around the front of the nose of the aircraft. The tractor was between the airplane and the bush and on the one side of the airstrip, so those people who were closer to the bush could run off into the bush, while those of us at the airplane and in front of it didn't have much of a place to go. They didn't have much protection in front of them. So they decided to independently run across the tarmac to the protection of some houses and trees on the other side. About at that stage, the embassy television tape ends with the murder of the cameraman. Oh my goodness, guys. I could not imagine, like, this whole thing was filmed from the time that the firing began. The congressman was a target, the cameraman was obviously a target, and that's insane. So Mr. Dwyer, he was lucky. He actually got to the other side of the airplane, and he decided there was no way that he could possibly make it across another 75 yards of open territory. And so, what did he do? He decided to play dead. Now, obviously, these are actually his recounts of the event, so we know he survived. But it's just crazy, like, what would you do in that situation? All of your hormones, your stress, your fight or flight would be activated. You would be full of adrenaline. And even if you played dead, how would you be able to remain still? That's kind of what I think of. In Mr. Dwyer's words, as I was about to artistically fall to the ground, and indeed I must have almost been on the ground, someone did shoot him. So he said, somebody shot me with a .22 long. As I later learned, I wasn't badly hurt. It had entered my left thigh and lodged up near the spine. It is still there. It is more dangerous to take it out than leave it alone. Holy crap, y'all. More from him. Anyways, as I was on the ground there, staccato firing continued for what seemed like a long time, but probably couldn't have been more than a couple of minutes. Yeah, I feel like if you're going through a tragedy, things like minutes stretch, like they just feel a lot longer than they are. So we had thought that the reason he didn't want to run across the tarmac or try to go any further was because he thought that they were in a crossfire between the big truck that was parked on the other side of the tarmac from the tractor, and thought that they were being fired on from that truck. Later, only one other person thought that they had been fired on from that truck, so he doesn't know whether they were or whether they weren't. So he was convinced that they would never make it past the truck. So at that point, he actually decided to lay on the ground, and the firing then stopped. So he was pretty much trying to pretend that he was dead, and he couldn't decide whether it would be more convincing to play dead with his eyes open or closed. So he decided that he would at least like to see the people that were firing at him. He actually used other language, but I'm not going to say that here. He heard feet on the loose stones of the dirt on the tarmac, and a shotgun went off. More steps, and the shotgun went off again. So Ryan had obviously been hit more than once. So the shotgun continued to fire 5 shots, including the one next to him, which was Ryan. At that point, he was waiting for the next shot, which never came. And he actually didn't know why, because he suspected that the last shot was used on Ryan, on the congressman. And I guess maybe they were doing it to make sure everyone was actually dead, or maybe they just really wanted to make sure that Ryan was dead, so on their way they just shot the other bodies. So the steps went away, and he pretty much laid on the ground until he finally heard the vehicles drive away. There was no conversation, no shouts that he could recall, but after a few moments, he did look around carefully, and there wasn't anybody there. Now, there was a Washington Post reporter lying not too far from him, and he knew he had done the same thing. He pretty much played dead. So he walked around to the congressman. He had been shot obviously more than once, probably with a rifle, but the better part of his face had been blown away with a shotgun. The cameraman was dead. The photographer from the Hearst newspapers was also dead. Everyone had fled the airplane into the bush, and when he went into the airplane, Miss Parks, Dale Parks' mother, was sitting in a seat near the door with most of her head blown away by the shotgun blast at short range. So now, he said that her face was still there, but there was nothing behind it, and it was pretty much like a sight that he never seen. They also had wounded all over the place. Jackie Spears had been badly hurt. A couple of the NBC cameramen had been badly hurt. And his immediate concern was that these people could come back and finish the job. So why they didn't finish the job, he doesn't know. Maybe they weren't really that good at anything. That's a quote from him, which is kind of funny. But they did carry the wounded over to the tall grass and hid them as much as they could. It wasn't too good, as you could see the tracks going into the grass, but I guess it's the best thing that they could do at the time. The news crew was an absolute shock. Everyone there had cameras, but no one pulled them out. The cameraman was killed. His audio guy had half of his arm shot away. And the anchorman for the NBC production that had interviewed Jim Jones had obviously been a target, and he was killed. He was dead. So it looked like some of this was very targeted. They went after primarily the cameraman and the congressman. I guess for some reason they didn't think that anyone else was capable of spreading what was going on there, but that's obviously kind of a dumb thought, but whatever. That's just my thoughts behind that. So Bob Flick, the producer of the show, was just absolutely stunned. He had worked with this crew through Vietnam and various war zones, among other places, and was just absolutely crushed that here in this rinky-dink country's backwoods, he had lost a major part of his crew. This is all quotes from Mr. Dwyer, not necessarily from me, so don't come at me for these words. I'm just pretty much trying to say what he said in a different way, So the producer, he sat with all the wounded all night and refused to leave. He gave them water, took care of them, held their hands, took down what he thought were their last words, and the rest of the news crew, they took 45 minutes, and then a number of them were back to normal, and they began writing their notes and comparing stories. That's pretty remarkable, actually, I think. If it was me, I would be trying to get the heck out of there. The People's Temple group, they were pretty remarkable, and so were the relatives. Nobody panicked, nobody broke down into hysterics, and Dr. Dwyer noted that he didn't know whether it was the idea of having lived with the People's Temple and being used to doing what somebody said without complaint, or whether it was a hard life that they stood up for themselves. But it was a very remarkable group, even the children. So they were told by the defectors from the People's Temple that they were sure that the White Knight would be for real back at Jonestown. So the White Knight, what is that? So that had been a rehearsal for death that Jones would have people go through a number of times in the middle of the night. He would get everybody out of bed by the loudspeakers, and they would come in and they would congregate, pass them Kool-Aid or some such drink, and tell them that it was poison. They would drink it, and they would wait and wait and wait. And then early in the morning and before dawn, probably around like 3, the government representative from the village came down to say that he had finally been in radio contact with Georgetown, that a company of troops were being flown into Matthews Ridge and would take the little freight train that used to haul the one down to Katuma. So they had a lot of practices. Last episode I talked about suicide drills, so they would practice this so often. So, like I said earlier, maybe they didn't think that they were going to actually die this time. So now the shooting, it had occurred around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and they had nothing but the first aid kit on the airplane to try and bandage everyone that was attacked. They found a nurse from a dispensary. She brought down all the morphine tablets she had. There weren't that many, though. They did give some people rum, but it was kind of a concerning thing to do, but it's all they really had. Obviously, they were going to need a lot of medical attention, and they were afraid to give them too much morphine or too much rum, even though they had severe pain. Amazing, though, how little complaint there was. It was just incredible. And that's words from Mr. Dwyer again. Of course, this is his witness account. And I guess with not being a medical professional, they didn't want to give them something and then they overdose or it completely affect their judgment or anything like that. So that can be a really hard decision to make too. You want these people out of pain, but you don't want it to mix wrongly. You don't want to give them too much and then things be even worse. So just imagine living through this. That's insane. So at this time, they didn't really know what had gone down at Jonestown, except for maybe one or two people had gotten away and came back with stories saying that they were all dead, killing themselves. But this came with the story that one of the people in our group told them that they had made a tank at Jonestown, which was hidden in the woods. There were like all sorts of rumors. This time it was almost dusk again. They flew into a small airport. The ambassador came over and debriefed them. He learned of the murders of Sharon Amos and her children at the People's Temple headquarters in Georgetown. Apparently, there had been instructions that everybody down there would kill themselves. The most difficult decision that the ambassador had to make at that time was what to do with the bodies at Jonestown. The Guyanese government had come up to him with the request that the bodies be taken back to the United States. John Burke quite correctly went back to Washington asking for instructions on how to do it. They could have been buried there, but there was all sorts of problems. On Sunday evening, when Mr. Dwyer was leaving, the military went into Jonestown and discovered, of course, that the worst had come to pass, and there were 900 odd bodies lying on the ground in the tropical heat, already beginning to decompose. The options were very limited on what they could do, and one of the major things to do was to try to identify the bodies. And I believe they had brought back to Jonestown a couple of the People's Temple members who went around and tried to identify the bodies. At least as many as they knew. They tagged them all. And of course, they tagged them all with washable ink. Why they did that, don't know. And then when it first rained, it was completely gone. So, not the best idea, but I guess I didn't really think that one through. The Guyanese government, of course, they were completely overwhelmed. There were no forensic facilities to speak of at all. The only option seemed to be to just bury them up there, but this had all kinds of problems. We knew that relatives and other people would certainly want to have the bodies of their relatives back, although as it turned out, there were not that many. There were a lot of people up there without relatives, or with relatives who didn't want the bodies back. In any event, Burke strongly urged the department to do this, and so they did. The Air Force came in with crews to take the bodies back. Woot woot. Go Air Force. They probably came with like C-17s or something, but with cargo planes. These crews, they were coming in on Monday morning. A typical Air Force operation, just an enormous mound of equipment and airplanes and everything else. The embassy at the time had probably about 70 or 80 survivors that had to be taken care of. Mr. Dwyer actually had an outside telephone on his desk in his office, and that had to be hooked up with the operations center with a speakerphone, and was just left open for 24 hours a day. They had, with the department's help, borrowed several consular officers from surrounding posts to help with the problems. They were pretty much submerged by the press, as anyone would guess. They were all over this. There were probably like 200 to 300 press members there, and from all over the world. Everyone from Agence France Presse to somebody from Spain and all the American news service and everything else. They besieged my poor wife and family in trying to get in and talk with me. That's definitely a quote from Dwyer. Man, imagine being his poor wife and her husband living through all this, and then you're getting bombarded by the press. Oh my goodness. I couldn't imagine this. So the major immediate problems at the embassy were threefold. The first was the removal of the bodies, then the preservation, insofar as possible, the site of the People's Temple, because they knew that the records and what have you of the People's Temple would be terribly important. And then there was all kinds of personal property up there, and as it turned out, all kinds of cash and everything else. So that was a second priority. And then another priority was obviously the remaining people from the People's Temple up there. For the first couple of days after the tragedy of Jonestown, particularly, there was a high state of wariness because many of the People's Temple people had told us that there had been plans that if this white night or mass suicide or murder ever came to pass, there were hit teams that were supposed to go out and assassinate various people. And indeed, in Jonestown, at the People's Temple headquarters, the People's Temple representative and her 3 or 4 children had been killed or had committed suicide. Oh my. It's just like how brainwashed these people were, and it's so sad to think that Jim Jones had so much control over them. Oh my. And it seems like some of the things he did tell them were true, or he made them think that so they would commit suicide instead. So, oh, I can't believe people lived through this, and I can't believe people were actually able to escape alive. So, one thing that Mr. Dwyer talked about was there were people with slit throats, but he's not sure that anybody else will know for sure, but certainly the younger children did not slit their own throats. They were told that there was a People's Temple basketball team, and that had included a number of the People's Temple security that was in Georgetown to play a basketball game with a Georgetown team. So those fellows were wandering around. And right about that time, he can't exactly remember when. It was probably like a few days later. The mayor of San Francisco, Moscone, had been assassinated. And there was concern in Georgetown, and I presume in San Francisco as well, that this might have been a People's Temple hit. Luckily, it turned out that it wasn't, but because of everything that was going on, they were concerned that it would be. The most far-out thing to come that developed was a series of newspaper articles out of the West Coast. And they picked up on some wire services, and they allegedly had all been a CIA conspiracy, that Jonestown had been used by the CIA to experiment with mind control drugs, and that Mr. Dwyer was their man on the scene, and after they had all been shot up at the airport, had gone back to Jonestown somehow and cleaned up everything and hidden all the records and things. I think that's completely crazy. Like, we know in the past the CIA, they've experimented on people with drugs and things like that, but I do not believe that at all for this. Because these are all Mr. Dwyer's words, and why would defectors want to go back there? Like, they wouldn't just want to go back there for no reason if it was a conspiracy. So, I don't believe that at all. In part, this did come from the admin assistant of Congressman Ryan, who, just judging by the news reports, had gone off the deep end, but it's whatever. In part, it was due to some young guy over in the CIA who had told this guy, and maybe someone else, that it had direct reports from their man on the scene, so he could give them the hot poop. There wasn't actually anybody there. It was just Mr. Dwyer. He was pretty much it. And it must have been very frustrating for any Foreign Service officer. As you know, they had standard procedures for questions, such as that. And any foreign officer who is asked such a question is to say that they can neither confirm or deny any such rumor. In some way, he kind of wishes that he just told the State Department to go to hell and say, no, I'm not CIA, never was, do not intend to be. But they were very sensitive there because there had been a man in Georgetown who had been with the agency, had been and was station chief. He had been identified as such in a book by a man called James Agee, and he had been assassinated. So possibly because of the identification in the book in Greece just a year or two before, people assumed that it was some type of CIA operative type thing. But that's not really true, and I don't really believe it to be true either. Only one person eventually was charged in Guyana with a crime, and that was the man who had been at the Georgetown People's Temple office. He was somewhat below intelligence, and he was suspected of and eventually was convicted of helping Sharon Amos kill her children. He had been a Marine, but was functionally illiterate, and to this day it was quite possible that he probably did what he was accused of, but in no way was he a leader or anything else in the group. And he did serve time for what he was convicted of. Later, there were other people that were accused of the conspiracy, and the murders was Larry Layton. Larry Layton had been on this small airplane. He had been the one that Mr. Dwyer had been warned about, and the congressman and the news had been warned about. That he was probably not a true defector. So he was kind of like more of a mole. He had been accused of shooting two people on the small airplane, and he was held for trial. The Guyanese government did not prosecute this case as well as they might have. And they probably did it on purpose. They didn't really want this guy in Guyana. They vastly preferred to get rid of him. So Larry Layton was acquitted. Now, back in the United States, he admitted that he had in fact shot those people, so there was no question about it. The Guyanese government had the decency of at least putting him on a direct flight to Miami, where he was arrested by the FBI. Layton was tried twice on 4 charges related to the shootings, including conspiracy to kill a congressman. He was released in 2002 because he did serve 18 years in prison. By the time they began to get the identity straightened out of the people who died at Jonestown, the FBI came to the conclusion that all of those that had been attacked outside the airport were dead. But Mr. Dwyer had a little list in his office, and whenever we would identify one, he would check them off. And he was pretty much relieved when they found that the last one there had been checked off. Because, unfortunately these people died, but you still want to identify them and make sure it was in fact them. And you want justice, and you want to make sure you can, if possible, bring the bodies back home, have a ceremony for them, funeral, whatever, and have closure. And you also want the accountability of making sure that everyone there was accounted for. Another thing that Mr. Dwyer noted was these people in Jonestown, they did record everything on audio tapes. They had all of Jim Jones' speeches. They discovered a tape that was like 45 minutes of the People's Temple, and that had affected him because it included Jim Jones' last, speech to the People's Temple, saying that they should all kill themselves, that the congressman was dead, and although Jones was not responsible for it, he had felt responsible for everything that had happened, and therefore the time had come to make the final protest, which was to be mass suicide. How is it a protest if you're dead? You have to be pretty alive to be in any type of protest. Honestly, Jim Jones was just pure evil. I think he knew that when all was said and done, if they were alive and he was still alive, he would be convicted for, I don't exactly know what for. I guess it depends on if these people killed themselves or not. But he was really worried about his image. He was very insecure about how he was portrayed in the media. So I guess because congressmen and defectors were coming, he didn't want to see things fall apart for him and his cult. At least that's my belief. So he just thought, oh, we're all just gonna kill ourselves. When really, dude, why don't you just kill yourself and leave everyone else to be? Ugh. And I don't want anyone to kill themselves, but it's like, dude, if you already had this thought and you were willing to do it yourself, with him being so evil, it's kind of like, dude, why did you drag everyone else with you when you're the big mind control behind everyone? He was the reason they did this. Now, the biggest question always came back to the fact, did these people in Jonestown kill themselves and commit suicide, or were they forced to do so? Obviously, under any criteria of any common law, children can't commit suicide voluntarily because they're not old enough to really consent to that. And they were given the juice. The children probably didn't fully have a grasp on what was going on. So there's really no question that the children have been murdered. They were murdered by their parents and their relatives, point blank. Very sad. It's almost hard to wrap my mind around it. Like, who would give their kid poison, whether they knew it was a real thing or a drill? Like, why? They're young. Let them live. And you drag them into this place. Oh, it's just... it's so sad. It's such a tragedy. On balance, Mr. Dwyer did say that he was convinced that the great majority of these people did, in fact, kill themselves. There were probably only a few, including Jim Jones, with bullet wounds. Some had injections of cyanide, but there was no way of telling whether those had been forced or not. Also, they had swallowed cyanide as well in many cases, so you didn't know whether these had been injections to hurry on what they had already started or what have you. So there's really no way of telling that, but I think there are survivor stories that maybe say differently. Like say that some people were forced, some people were killed. So I guess it just depends on who you ask and whose perspective. Because you have to remember, Mr. Dwyer was on the airstrip. He wasn't necessarily in Jonestown. He was there kind of after the fact. So he probably didn't witness what actually happened. So who's to say that his opinion on that aspect is correct or not? Now, a year or two later, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine that reported on a woman who very much regretted that she had not been there. She had pretty much survivor's guilt. She had been in the United States for some reason, but she still regretted that she had not been there to take her own life with her colleagues. Goodness, that's... oh my. That, to me, that's crazy. Like, I would be thankful to be alive, but maybe she was later. I'm not judging, but it's just really sad that he had them manipulated so much to the point where they would all do this. In Mr. Dwyer's opinion, and I think for me as well, the biggest mental anguish came from the children. These children, Mr. Dwyer had personally witnessed them playing and had played with them just hours before they were being killed by their parents. And I agree to that. Like, kids are so innocent. They don't deserve any of this. They're there just to be kids. They don't understand all the politics behind everything. They do as they're told, but in the end, they don't have the decision to really make that personal choice of drinking the Kool-Aid or not. It's sad, and they're young. They don't have a full grasp on what reality is. They have imaginations, and they're meant to be kids. They're not meant to deal with stuff like this. And I think it's really sad that they succumbed to this in the end. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on Jonestown? There's definitely a lot more that could be said about this. There's a lot more deep dive, but man, I just wanted to give y'all an overview of what happened and from one guy's perspective. So another thing I didn't tell you guys in the beginning, I know I promised I would get this released sooner than Wednesday, and I'm really, really sorry, but it has been a crazy week. We have friends in town from Guatemala visiting, so yeah, it's really hard to balance my time. But I do promise that from Friday to Sunday, I will have one more episode posted. A bonus, if you will. And it will be about Halloween, because a lot of people don't know, but there's a lot of psychology that goes behind Halloween. Yeah, probably didn't think of it in that way, did you? So, look forward to that. I will try to post it as soon as I can, but like I always say, no promises, because I don't like to make promises and break them when I am not 100% sure if I can keep them or not. So, well, it has been fun talking about Jonestown. Very tragic indeed. but we can learn a lot from this. We can learn a lot about manipulation and people like Jim Jones. And that's not the only cult that we're gonna cover. We're gonna do the Halloween episode, and then I don't know if we're gonna take a little break from cults or not, but we're definitely gonna continue our cult series and talk about other ones. And any other ideas you guys have, please send them my way. I love hearing what you guys think. I love hearing your ideas. Yeah, I love it. I love interacting with you guys. Also, I don't know if you know, but we have a Facebook page and a Facebook group. So if you want to look that up, WT Psychology on Facebook, you can always join. Also, I only have a few reviews on Apple. If anyone has a place where they can review the podcast, like submit a review or whatever, I would greatly appreciate it. But that's completely up to you. I'm going to love you nonetheless. Also, I did order more stickers. They're smaller than the ones that I did send out. So if anyone wants stickers, please let me know. You don't have to pay for them. I'm still early in this, and I will put it in an envelope and send it to you. So let me know if you want one or not. And you get it for free. You get that for being an awesome listener of mine. That's pretty much all the business. I am your host, Katie Gonzalez, and you've been listening to What the? Psychology. Stay psyched, y'all.